it appeared to me that the U-2 people were the most surprised people in the world to find out the plane is up there. The plane was sent by some other motivation, which was very limited.
Something fishy went on here.
Well, I knew because my men were provided hydrogen.
You see, the difference for me is I lived with the people. I know, like in the case of some of these documents, I've still got the papers that I wrote by hand. I couldn't type very well, so I wrote the things by hand. I still got my notes. Hell, I know. I don't have to go find it. But I know they're still telling lies because they won't put the information.
I got this in a note from a person in level of the Office of Secretary of Defense that certain people fixed the plane so it came down, and Gary Powers would know nothing about it.
On May the 1st, 1960, a U-2 unarmed reconnaissance plane took off to fly a spy mission over the Soviet Union. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers, who was employed by the CIA and was claimed to have been shot down by the Soviet military at 70,000 feet, approximately 1,200 miles inside the Soviet Union. In the following days, Nikita Khrushchev exploited the U.S. government's cover story and walked out of the summit meeting in Paris on May 16, 1960. There is a direct relationship between the U-2 incident and the end of U.S. President Eisenhower's Crusade for Peace. In response to Khrushchev, the U.S. Department of State issued a statement on May 7, 1960 that, insofar as the authorities in Washington are concerned, there was no authorization for any such flight as described by Mr. Khrushchev. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty worked in the Pentagon at that time, and he has a very interesting recollection of this event. What follows are 4 separate interviews regarding Gary Powers' U-2 flight.
It said that the U-2 flights over Russia, the Americans shared the information with the British freely, and in return, the British supplied pilots. I saw a picture, it looked like 10, 15 guys, and evidently they were U-2 pilots, and it claimed that these guys were British. Now that goes against the thinking that, what's the thing was shot down?
Well, the British had U-2s.
Oh, their own U-2s.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The U-2 wasn't a CIA thing. They couldn't maintain airplanes. SAC maintained the Air Force. The U-2 selected the targets and the time of going and that sort of thing. But the planes were supported by the military. They were purchased by the military. I made one of the original phone calls simply as a function of my office. Mm-hmm. The system I had furnished supplies for them all to their operation, and it was a professional flight operation, which the CIA was authorized to use for spying purposes. The secret of the U-2 was the camera. Geez, the camera was so advanced that's the U-2 that went down, the Powers on it, didn't have the U-2 camera. It had an ordinary old bomber camera.
Oh, really?
In other words, somebody ahead of time selectively had taken the Lundahl out and let I even have somewhere the serial number, the one that was on the U-2 that went down. It wasn't a Lundahl. And
that's another telling.
In other words, they were trying so hard to keep the Lundahl out of the Soviets' hands that.
But they knew that plane was going down.
Yeah, well, that plane had crashed previously. It was landing in Japan and run short of fuel at the base where Oswald was working. At the time, he was working there.
At Sugi.
And it bellied in, which didn't hurt. It lands on the belly anyway. It's got a little tiny wheel underneath, but no other wheels. And they brought it to Lockheed, and the Lockheed people rebuilt it. And in the process, it appears, put a different camera in it and maybe some other things to protect secrets. And then that's the plane that flew over the Soviet Union, which is kind of an interesting story.
So to get back to this, the British were able to use those planes, or they bought their own?
I don't know whether they bought them or whether they were
just
made available.
For the job,
It's just like I was telling you about the Norwegian operation we had, where the planes are based in Norway, but we used non-American pilots a good bit of the time to fly them over the Soviet Union regularly. It's a way clandestine work is done so that it isn't attributable, but of course there's no way you can deny where a U-2 comes from. So it's got to be an American airplane.
But in that case, Gary Powers was in a uniform or a jumpsuit.
Well,
information with them?
You know, you did the famous pictures of taken of everything he had in his pockets when he went down. Well, the U-2 pilots didn't have any pockets, for one thing. I mean, you're not going to have a guy that's supposed to be a spy and then equip him with everything else, you know, his club card and his automobile license and all that. And plus the trinkets he was supposed to hand out to bribe people to take care of him, and a flag that's saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, I need your help, and, you know, escape and evasion kit. Well, that's ridiculous. Well, Powers didn't know that was on the plane. The parachute has two seats. One is the one you sit on, and one is your parachute. It was in between the two seats. Somebody had put his stuff there. They took it from him and said, you're going on a flight. They put it. So when he landed, the Russians found it, and they said, here's what he had with him. What do you mean, tell us you're not an American military pilot? All that stuff is contrived. But the facts that came out later proved the whole darn thing was set up that way. He was surprised to find out what they claimed he had on board.
In the facts, I'm not familiar with them. Did he crash land, or did he actually just land?
Well, the distinction in a U-2 is not very great.
Okay.
If you got a runway, it's not a crash. If it's in a field, it is a crash. The underneath of a U-2 has just a small single wheel, and because it's made as light as it can be. In fact, all the pilots called it a glider. And the wreckage that they showed was sent to Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, and he said that wreckage never came from one of our airplanes. It's just some junk they had in Moscow, and took a picture of it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the picture of the wreckage of U-2 is not the U-2.
Because they did show big pictures of the cabin and that, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that was
They had the plane. And another thing was that in one of the pictures, the U-2 is shown, and the canopy, the big plastic canopy over the top of the pilot, is laying on the ground, unbroken, not broken. But you couldn't take, it'd be like dropping a glass from 100 feet up, and it didn't break. I mean, they contrived the Russians were trying to get, you know, trying to prove to the world that they could bring a plane down from 80 or 90,000 feet. And see, that's why they built the plane. They knew at Lockheed that nothing the Russians had could reach the altitude the operating altitude of the airplane. Therefore, it couldn't be brought down. So when the Russians said they did bring it down, the first thing Dulles said to the Fulbright Committee was they couldn't have reached it at its operating altitude. It came down lower, and then they got it. Well, it got it means they put MiGs around it, flying with it. Somebody said that there was a reporter over there who was riding on a train or something like that. We wrote a story about the sky was full of MiGs. But
so they just forced him down.
Yeah, that's when he was down low altitude. Well, and of course, his engine wasn't running. His engine had conked out. See, the U-2 had to have special fuel.
Hydrogen.
And the special fuel was combined. The JP fuel, the ordinary fuel we use like in an airline airplane, and hydrogen, raw hydrogen. And the hydrogen tank only had half enough. So when it ran out, the plane came down right halfway on the flight.
In the middle.
Yeah, predictable.
Right in the heart of the Soviet Union. But it's your position that Alan Dulles didn't know that they had put all this identification in there, or even that the flight was being run.
Well, I don't think I ever said I wrote that.
No, you didn't write it.
There's no way to know. It appeared to me that the U-2 people were the most surprised people in the world to find out that plane is up there. The plane was sent by some other motivation, which was very limited, and got it in the air because my office was across the hall from the U-2 people's office. And I provided support. And that morning when I came to work, their office was bedlam. And I wondered, what's the matter? And finally one of the guys said, we just lost the plane. If they lost the plane, they wouldn't have been all shook up. You know, they would have known it was lost. They were shook up because they didn't know a plane was in the air. That's what bothered them. And another thing you should know about this kind of work is the office directly across from me was called Cover and Deception. Every time there's an operation, you have another office saying all the different ways that it couldn't possibly have happened. You know, like robbing a bank. You work out your cover story ahead of time. So you go rob the bank when you have your friend in Las Vegas saying, "Oh no, my friend was with me. We were in room 110, and we couldn't have possibly been robbing a bank. We were out in Las Vegas." You got to have your cover. But this is the way the government would work. It's either you two guys, my office, and the cover people, and we all supported each other. So I provided the hydrogen, among other things. When I say I don't mean personally. I had a system of
Yeah.
thousands of guys that did these things.
So it's a very small window or group of people who could have ordered that even in the air.
Yeah, that's right. It
Yes.
was very. There was something about somebody that was able to make the phone call that said go, and the guys in the field had no way to cross-check it, and the plane went. So there it was.
So could it have been? So it wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this the event that stopped the summit meeting, right?
The summit
Between
conference, yeah. Oh, it very definitely was timed to the summit conference, because had that at that time, if you just look at the newspapers before May 1st of '60, you'll see that this coming summit conference was drawing columns by reputable writers that there was going to be a détente between the old war buddies Khrushchev and Eisenhower, who during World War II were allies, and that they were sort of had the same desire for peace in the world and so on, and that this was going to be their last big deal. And
So it sounds to me like it's more of this high cabal kind of thing, not wanting there to be peace.
exactly,
Essentially.
yeah, exactly. And the timing is the clue,
Right.
because it's just like in Kennedy's assassination, the release of his plans for Vietnam, take all Americans out, cost him his life. That and the fact that he was definitely going to be reelected, so they would have no chance to recapitulate the things that he was ordering. So that's another thing that writers ought to be smart enough to do, is there is a very fine book, the Foreign Relations of the U.S., Volume 4, Vietnam, for the period August of '63 to December '63. It centers right in on those few months. And in it, it has, I think, 26 meetings in the White House by top people in the government on the Vietnam situation. They didn't bring in the Department of Commerce and all that stuff. Talking about Kennedy's plan. They were developing Kennedy's plans right there with Kennedy. They named the people that were there every time. My boss was there at most of the meetings. When he wasn't there, he was out in Vietnam getting some information that they wanted, then came right back again.
Is that Krulak?
Krulak.
Yeah.
And all this is you can get on. I got it on a bookshelf upstairs. Anybody can walk in a government print office and get it. And there's Kennedy's plans for Vietnam that positively say take the 1,000 men out as a token by the end of the year. We'll have everybody out by '65, and I'm not sending anybody into Vietnam. That cost him his life.
As well as a lot of other people.
It's just like the U-2 affair cost Eisenhower the chance to talk to Khrushchev and probably reach a détente. That's what his goal was. He had been working on Crusade for Peace.
Yeah,
He
right.
went to New Delhi, India. The biggest crowd ever assembled came to see him, and they planned to go to Moscow and have a bigger crowd there.
So what does somebody like Eisenhower do or think when that happens?
Oh, according,
Do you know?
yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
he has written a book, or part of a book. I forgot just where I have the thing that where he mentions that. He mentioned that Powers wasn't shot down. Eisenhower does. And from that time on, he was, he had a lot of heart attacks, and he was a very weak person, very weak man. And Nixon was almost running the government. Whenever there'd be meetings, say, for the Cuban anti-Castro program, which had nothing to do with Bay of Pigs, when Eisenhower approved it, it would always be Nixon handling the meetings. Eisenhower wouldn't be there. His last year or so, he was just a figurehead.
But did he write anything then, saying what his opinion was of the whole thing?
I don't know whether it's his own writing or somebody writing him about it. I think maybe Emmett Hughes might have written it. But it was to the fact that Eisenhower said the plane made one of its normal crash landings. He was using those words as any military man would, because it isn't a conventional landing when the U-2 comes down. But he definitely is saying that the Russians didn't shoot it down. But the best source on that is Dulles himself in the same month, in the May of '60, before the Foreign Relations Committee. Dulles says that in just plain words.
And then he was almost blackmailed, either fire Dulles and Cabell and whoever.
You say that Khrushchev gives him a way out after the discovery. First of all, Khrushchev announces that they've caught, that they shot down a plane. And he doesn't say anything else, an American plane. And then Dulles provides a cover story. which is readily disproved by the Russians because they had a whole bunch more information than what they...
They said it was gathering weather information or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, NASA was doing all the publicity. The CIA was out of the picture. It was supposed to be a NASA airplane, upper weather atmospheric checks.
And he says, in your book it says, the Russian premier was ready to say, "We are so close to the summit and to peace. I am ready to accept that this was a cruel and terrible provocation made by others without the knowledge of the American president. Let the president stand up and say that he had no knowledge of this flight, and then back up his statement by firing Allen Dulles, Dick Bissell, and those other 4 men who had pressed so hard for this flight." So I'm curious who those 4 men were, and had Allen Dulles and Dick Bissell really pressed so hard for that flight?
Well, I think in their position, they couldn't, it was their U-2. I mean, their flight had been approved. But what you had to have read earlier in there, and I'm sure you did, was that the order for no overflights was non-exclusive. In other words, nobody was authorized. I grounded all the planes I was using to fly over Asia, and we were flying in those days all the way from Taiwan up to Kokonor, and from Thailand up to Tibet. And we were just covering the area with a lot of airplanes. We just grounded them all. In fact, it probably cost us the Tibetan campaign because we were keeping the Kampas alive with food and medicine and weapons by dropping into their mountains all the time. We stopped, and they couldn't figure out what on earth had happened to us. Here we were supporting them and encouraging them to fight, and we stopped, which was a pretty bad thing to do. Well, all of a sudden, out of the clear, here comes a U-2 flight, which is an overflight. And just a short time before that, I had asked the Secretary of Defense to ask the White House for permission to fly over the Kampas with food and medicine. I said, we won't take any weapons, but the 4 guys need this. And the White House turned it down. So I knew the White House was emphasizing the fact, no overflight. Then this flight took off. Well, ostensibly, it's a CIA flight. You have to figure, since the only person in CIA that could authorize it in the final analysis is Allen Dulles. But Allen Dulles wasn't talking. So he was, and when he did talk before the Foreign Relations Committee, he said clearly, it wasn't shot down. In other words, Khrushchev is wrong. He's telling a lie. There's something else to it. And Allen Dulles was, and you can just read in the testimony how uncertain he was about the facts himself. So he was almost saying, I didn't know about that, and I wasn't sure about this. He's almost saying, I didn't send that plane out. He didn't say it that way, but if you read the transcript carefully, you get that meaning out of it.
Now, is what you're telling us here now, and Dulles' possible uncertainty about this, is this something that you have come to since writing this book? Because this paragraph sounds like Dulles and Bissell pressed so hard for this flight and for other people.
What I'm talking about there is not the specific flight. What I was told when I found out that they made a flight that I thought was prohibited by Eisenhower, that they must have pressed for it. What alternative was there? Later, I got a hold of a copy of the transcript, and I could see what was bothering them. And see, these transcripts don't come out immediately.
Right.
You get the things later. And what I knew from the U-2 contacts I had was that it wasn't a normal flight. And this business of getting it to be flown at all, I knew had to have been done without Eisenhower's permission, because, I'll say White House permission, because that's the people who turned me down with the planes over Asia. There's no overflights.
With the Gary Powers story and your inside knowledge that he was, that he landed, he was forced down, and it somehow appeared that I think you put in your book, The Secret Team, Allen Dulles, Bissell, and those 4 other men or something like that. Do you think there's any avenues to corroborate that story that the Cold War, certain people in the Pentagon had decided?
I
And the
showed
reason-
you a paper yesterday, if you happen to remember, that had the name Eric Varney on it, and I told you that Varney was a guy I respected for many, many years, but he retired, and he lives out in New Mexico now. Well, Varney, on the day that Powers went down, just came in my office like this. He said, "Fletch, here." And it said, "These 4 guys did it," and he left. A couple of weeks later, he left the Pentagon. Well, they were people that were very easy to realize could have done it because they were in the scientific jobs where the U-2 was a pretty new airplane that could have made it impossible to send a U-2 or could have fixed it. And very few people knew that the U-2 carried hydrogen. Even the pilots wrote in. After I had written in the gallery, I think, that Powers had run out of hydrogen, pilots wrote to the company and said, "We don't have hydrogen in the airplane." Well, later on, the same pilots wrote and said, "We found out we do." See, it was that kind. They didn't know they had the Lundall camera. They just were up there to fly the plane. And when the plane was found on the ground, it didn't have a Lundall camera. Who took it out first, see? Or who put Powers' money in between the parachute seat? If he bailed out, it would have been spread all over the place. They knew he wasn't going to bail out. Well, things like that, you just can't ignore.
And his driver's license, what else?
Well, they were all that stuff.
Yeah.
Driver's license, his PX card, rings that he was supposed to give women to help him escape, and all that sort of stuff. There's pictures of. I take the picture of it right down there and show it to you, of the stuff that was, personal belongings. And what they do, see, when a pilot goes on a flight, they bring him in the room, strip. Doctor looks at him, superficial. And then he put the suit on, put a jumpsuit on with one zipper, no pockets, no nothing. The zipper and the cloth can't be identified as being American-made or Chinese-made. He jumps in this thing. They put him in the plane, and at the end, in a jeep, and at the end of the runway, there's 3 U-2s, and he's one of 3 pilots going out there. First guy gets in his plane and says, "You're not going." Next guy gets in his and he says, "You're going." No guy over here gets in, "You're not going." The guy's going. That means he can't sneak anything in the plane ahead of time, or pay off the crew chief to slip a bottle of gin in there or something like that. He doesn't know which plane he's going to, if he's going. It's a beautiful system, see. Well, when you know all those things, it's easy to extrapolate that the guy came down because they planned to have him come down because he didn't have enough hydrogen. His parachute pack was fixed ahead of time. His suit, the pockets didn't make any difference because they wouldn't let him have the stuff anywhere. On any flight, he wouldn't have anything in his pockets. But on any flight, they wouldn't put the stuff in a parachute because if he used the parachute, it would all fly away and then he wouldn't have it. So it all explains itself if you know enough about it. Well, this guy Varney was the first man I knew who was able to say this is the way it went, and he was brought down. And that's true. They wanted to cancel out. See, at that time, Eisenhower and Khrushchev had become, if not friends, understanding of each other.
Yeah.
People say, well, how could that happen? They never met each other. It didn't matter. Eisenhower's longtime, highly regarded, best friend, chief executive officer, was Walter Beadle Smith. He had been ambassador to Moscow, and he had had contact with Khrushchev, who liked the old boy, and they got together. So the path had been all wired, and what they were going to do is just have a tremendous meeting in Moscow when Khrushchev invited him over to, I think he was supposed to be there in August of 60 or something like that, because see, that would help the re-election, it would help for Nixon to be elected. It was all planned. Well, that broke down. They didn't have the Moscow meeting. Remember that wonderful picture that was in some movie of where Eisenhower flies to Moscow in Air Force One, and when he gets out the plane, there's nobody there to meet him. Did you ever see that in that movie? There's nobody to meet him in Moscow. Here comes Eisenhower. And they balanced that by the fact that when he went to New Delhi, India, there were more than 1 million people to meet him. See, if you know all that story, the whole thing becomes pretty easy.
Well, the reason I asked was that in some of these foreign relation books, you know the full story, and you can say, look, if this is missing and you see that, that's entirely true. And I just wanted to know if there was anything else that we could look into as far as those kind of foreign relation books and things like that that spell out.
You mean, sure. I think I've told you that. This, see, it says U2 up there?
Yeah.
That's the meeting held by the Foreign Relations Committee in May of 1960, and it has the, it has Alan Dulles talking to him, saying, you want to see it?
Well, Senate Foreign Relations Committee Historical Series, Volume 12.
Yeah. Let me just show you something here. Where the hell am I talking about? 337.
Not hid. Yeah, you had also said that you had heard from some people at the Skunk Works where they analyzed the photos and they said, that's not U2 wreckage, that's just a pile of junk.
That's when they sent it back to Lockheed. You're right. See, this is Dulles. We don't have information, and this is only one time he says this, there's other times we don't have information that is all complete. It is our belief that there was some malfunction of the plane when it was at an altitude that is around 70,000 feet. He was undercutting because he didn't want to tell them. These planes, under certain conditions, do flame out at very high altitudes. Whether that malfunction was or was not caused by ground-air missiles, we don't know. Now that's that point. Then at another point, he comes out real clear.
Well, I think that the first-hand knowledge you have, if someone else told you that, listen, something fishy went on here.
Well, I knew because my men would provide the hydrogen.
Eisenhower, in his last year, had been quite ill from the time he had heart trouble and stroke and all that kind of stuff. But he had a goal. He wanted to go out after 8 years of president and after being the commander of the European forces and a lifetime spent in that stuff. He wanted to go what he called Crusade for Peace, and he was just going everywhere. And I think in New Delhi, over 1 million people stood out there in New Delhi to greet him. I mean, he's immensely popular. So, and he and Khrushchev had met several times, like personally, at Camp David. That's why it's Camp David. And Eisenhower and Khrushchev, I believe, had begun to see eye to eye, two old boys from World War II, that they'd like to see all this mess cleared up. But anyway, so they're going to have a summit conference on May 10th in Paris with Eisenhower and Macmillan and de Gaulle and Khrushchev. It was so important that they began to plan for everything that might happen before it would take place that would create bad headlines. So one thing that was said was no overflights, no overflights. Well, the U-2s were overflying in the regular reconnaissance business. It wasn't a big deal at that time. In 60, it was just a flight one time, and then a couple of weeks, another flight, and so on. In fact, they had never flown across the Soviet Union up to that time. I was flying loads of aircraft into Tibet and into Western China on those programs that had to do with China's encroachment on Tibet and the destruction of the Tibetan government. We got the Dalai Lama out. And by the way, a year ago, I met the Dalai Lama, and he told me I was the first person he'd ever met from the teams that got him out. We shook hands and stood there. He ignored the other people who were around. He was just great. We had a wonderful time. But we were working on that full time. That was going full steam. And I got this order to stop the overflights. And I can't do that. I'm bringing food and medicine and ammunition to people fighting for their lives. We can't do that. So I went to see Mr. Gates, the Secretary of Defense, and said, look, you better talk to the National Security Council, see if they won't give us the right to fly just our transport plane, no combat plane, but our transport planes over Tibet to feed these people. And the order came back, no overflights. Well, by that time it was about April, and I had to ground the plane. Then this one morning, we hear this doggone U-2 had gone over the Soviet Union. Well, I knew there's no way it could go because no approval. All overflights were down. Eisenhower certainly didn't approve that. Nobody did. And then we didn't have enough information. Well, they had this rather poorly contrived cover story saying that NASA had pilots flying U-2s at high level testing upper air currents and all that stuff, and probably the guy's oxygen equipment went bad and he couldn't navigate the plane and he landed in Russia. And Eisenhower believed that, because that was a story that was published around the world. It was a story that had been written in case they needed it, you know, if they need a cover story. And finally, on the 7th of May, I think, from the 1st of the plane went down on the 1st, Khrushchev said, I've been interested in these stories going back and forth because when I said we had shot a plane down on the 1st of May, he said, I forgot to say something. So I forgot to say that we had the pilot alive. He's right here with me. You know, oh my God, the Pentagon just flipped. I mean, the whole building did a backflip. And I mean, that was, my offices were across the hall from the U-2 offices. The guys in the U-2 office were just, because see, they didn't know what happened to it. They were the guys running the program, I mean, for the CIA, like I was doing my programs for the CIA. Just stunned, you know, it couldn't have happened. Well, at that point, Eisenhower about going wild, because then he did hear about it, and then he did find out what had happened. So that was the 7th of May. He had this conference coming up on the 10th, and as I understand, they postponed it a week, I think, back to the 16th or something, and he went, and it was a fizzle, and Khrushchev started lecturing everybody about what you do and don't do, and, you know, can't blame him. And he's saying, we shot your damn plane down like that, you know. Well, meanwhile, up at the Senate are holding hearings. The Fulbright Committee, Foreign Relations Committee, are holding hearings to find out who the hell sent this thing out, see? And they're talking to all these people about why was the flight sent out. And in the hearings, which are perfectly public, you don't have to wait for this review board to give them to you, Allen Dulles told Fulbright, that airplane was not shot down. It landed and the pilot got out. Did you see the pictures with the canopy, plastic canopy laying on the farm there? Well, even today, if it's in the papers, it says the plane was shot down. Now, isn't that terrible? But you can go to the government printing office and you can get a book that thick. I've got a copy upstairs, government printing office, U-2, and it's in Eisenhower's biographical record. At one point, he told some friends. He said, you know, that airplane landed up there, and the pilot got out. Landed. He said, U-2, you know, has only one little wheel under it. It doesn't have wheel like regular plane. And just landed. The pilot got out, and naturally they captured him. He's standing there in a farm. Well, this is part of the lore of the whole thing. It's like the lore of the Oswald story. What the hell were we trying to hide that was so... Well, what they were hiding was that somebody else sent the plane out, not the CIA and not the military. The CIA was operating them anyway. But the plane had been in a previous accident in Japan. It had been brought back from Japan to the Lockheed factory and rebuilt. And there, the biggest secret of the U-2 was its special camera called the Lundahl camera. But anyway, they took the Lundahl camera out and put a regular camera in it. Now, how could it happen by chance that a plane that had an accident, had a different camera in it, is the plane that Gary Powers was flying? Because, of course, he thought he was flying one with the Lundahl camera. No sense of going with his other ordinary old bomber camera, you see. Another thing, in his seat pack...
The reason was because they knew that the plane was going to go maybe down.
They knew it was going down.
They didn't want to waste these expensive cameras, so they would replace it.
Whoever sent the plane knew it was going to go down, see? And they didn't want to get rid of the camera because that would give the secret of the Lundahl away. The Lundahl was more important than anything else, so they took it out. And then they sent poor old Powers out there and put him, another Oswald, see, exactly, another Oswald. And the plane goes down. Well, of course, the whole world, Khrushchev bragged that it was shot down, see, why not? Because he had to brag to his people it was shot down. But Allen Dulles was very, very frank. In his testimony, it says clearly, if a missile had hit the plane, and at that altitude is only a missile because no airplane can get up there, it would have been disintegrated in the thin air up there. It would just disintegrate. If he hit it with a stone, it would have disintegrated, see? It's like an airplane flying hit a bird. The whole wing comes off. Well, he said there wouldn't have been anything left. and here the whole plane is in pictures, or major parts of it. So it was a deal set up. Well, in the middle of all this, I'm sitting in my office doing my work, and an old hand employee of the government, a great guy, very, very competent guy that I had known for probably 20 years of my own career, and he was working for the Secretary of Defense at the time, came into my office the day that we really announced the thing had gone, and really his face was as white as a sheet. And he said, you know, they sent it out. And I said, what do you mean? And he gave me a little piece of scrap paper, like when you get a telephone call, you know, somebody, and there were 4 names on it, people I know. And he put it on my desk, and he said, they did it. And he took off, he got out, he lives in the Rockies, in a little home he built out there, get just as far as he can from Washington as he can. The poor guy, he worked with these fellows, and they were in a position where they could get it sent out. They sent it out. Well, now, that's the equivalent of an assassination, because they destroyed Eisenhower's career there. They created a peak in the Cold War, you know, but the thing that gets me is over and over and over again, I have talked to newspaper reporters, and as I told you, the name of Nick Horrock, a top guy, and I know a lot of them like that. I said, for God's sake, next time you write about the U-2, don't say it was shot down. Read the congressional record and cite the congressional record and say, Allen Dulles said it just landed, Eisenhower said it just landed. Anybody knows it just landed, the pilot's alive. You know, what are you going to do? But you see, you cannot get the newspapers to publish that.
Are you in a position to tell us 1 or 2 or 4 of the names of?
No, because I don't know whether they're alive now, and I wouldn't do it if they are. Because if they don't tell, I'm not going to. They were working, you know, I was an employee, they were an employee. They probably had a reason. Somebody probably told them.
But do you think somebody cut in on this operation? In other words, you said it wasn't Dulles at the CIA. And Dulles, I want to ask you about Dulles after this. He fascinates me and always has. Maybe you could tell me a little story or something about his personality or something interesting about Allen Dulles.
Well, first of all, to the operation. When you have planes flying like that, you see, at the base where they're stationed, they get a certain coded message, send it out. And so the base commander, and his name's been in the paper 100 times, I don't remember it, but some Air Force colonel takes the plane to Pakistan, to Peshawar, I think, and they go with a team of guys that support the operation. And we put 3 planes on the end of the runway so the pilot doesn't know which one he's going in, and the 3 pilots don't know which one is going, you know, because they could put stuff in the plane ahead of time to either protect themselves or some other thing, you know, but they don't. And then when they finally bring the guy out and say, okay, you're going in this airplane, then he's going. Because you see, Powers didn't know that in his parachute was all this sort of escape and evasion stuff, and gold rings and coins and all. He didn't know that was in it. It was tucked in it. Even when he was walking around afterwards with his jumpsuit on that had no pockets, with cloth that we went to the trouble of buying in some other country so they couldn't say this is an American pilot, you know, no insignia, no nothing. But his driver's license, his military pass, everything else is down in his parachute, see? Well, how did somebody know he wasn't going to use his parachute? If he used his parachute, it might have all been gone, see? It's very carefully planned out. Well, it couldn't just have been, you know, that. But why people aren't told that now? Here it is, 94, and it happened in 60. It's just astounding. And it isn't because people don't know. I mean, my God, I've told 100,000 people myself. I wrote it in my book. The thing wasn't shot down, and my books had some circulation.
And what would be one of the ways to bring that to low fuel?
Yeah, that's the secret. Because at that altitude, with the engines of that time, the engine was special built for the U-2, with titanium blades and everything. The fuel has so much trouble burning that if you put a match to it, it wouldn't light. So they learned through experience that you had to put hydrogen through with the fuel, and a trickle of hydrogen would liven the fuel up, and it would continue to burn. It wouldn't start, but it would continue to burn. So if you take off on normal fuel, then you get up to altitude, you begin to let the hydrogen in. It'll continue. But the hydrogen's in a little bottle, like a propane tank or something. When the hydrogen runs out, your engine will run until the first time it has like a little cough, and it'll go out, and you can't restart. Well, his hydrogen ran out over Sverdlovsk, and down he comes, and nothing he can do about it. Well, my program used to provide the hydrogen for the U-2s. I don't know who messed with it out there where it came from, but it would have been simple just to open the tank and run out 50%. The pilot never sees it. They lower him into the plane from a little derrick. He doesn't see what's there. So that's a simple way of bringing it down. And when I first published that in my book in 71 or 72, the Lockheed people told guys, pilots, and everybody else in the program that there's no hydrogen in your airplane. Don't even think about it. And years later, they began to tell me that, yeah, there was hydrogen. The pilots used to write to me and say, oh, there was hydrogen in our plane. Of course there was. We were sending it out for all the time. I mean, this is important to COPA. See, news is so, it isn't just Kennedy. And the news is out. People know it. It's printed. But the news...
Put together.
It has nothing to do with security. The things I'm quoting have been on the shelves of GPO for years. And this is what fascinates me, how it can be perfectly open, no classification. You don't have to have this committee looking up for classified records. I'd be afraid of those records because they've had 30 years to write them. They don't tell them what they say. But when Allen Dulles testified in May of 1960, his testimony's in print and is available. Why isn't that out in the public? See, this is the big problem. It isn't just who hid something in a Warren Commission report.
Well, I guess nobody's writing for historians. If a historian doesn't dig it up, nobody's going to give it to us without an overarching reason.
The doors of the GPO aren't locked. There's a store right on North Capitol Street. They've even got retail stores all over the country now. And they're not locked. And you can write to them and say, I want the book I've got upstairs. All you got to do is write and send them a couple of bucks and it's yours. But give it to a newspaper reporter and say, put it in your newspaper tomorrow, and he won't. That's where the problem is. It had nothing to do with the review committees in the government. Well, not directly. This is a fascinating thing about it. See, you see, the difference for me is I lived with the people. I know. Like in the case of some of these documents, I've still got the papers that I wrote by hand. I couldn't type very well, so I wrote things by hand. I still got my notes. Hell, I know. I don't have to go find it. But I know they're still telling lies because they won't put the information out.
So it's all about Pope, Alan Pope. And it seems to me that he was working on clandestine operations anyway. And you mentioned him in your book, The Secret Team, the fact that he had been shot down, but much like Gary Powers, he had identification that normally is prohibited on a flight.
Yeah, we were stunned to learn that because the pilots on those flights, and of course there were more B-26s than his, there were more pilots than Pope. That operation in Indonesia, as I recall it, was the largest operational activity the CIA had ever undertaken. And we had reopened, we might say, an island in the Pacific that had been a military war base during the Pacific for bombers in the war against Japan during World War II. So we had a whole base there. And then we operated out of Manado, which is mentioned here. And it was a pretty good-sized operation. But what blew it up was it was ostensibly, we will say, being operated clandestinely, and nobody knew who was supporting the rebels. Well, of course, that's fantasy, but that's the way it was being operated. And when Pope went down with all this identification in his pocket that said he was an Air Force captain, mentioned organizations, I think it even had his automobile license and things like that from the base on the Philippine Islands, the U.S. government was exposed. Immediately, I think it was Ambassador Jones at the time, was called in to explain it, and the whole thing was blown. And then they knew that the operation was being supported by the United States and not by some phantom organization. Well, that was the role of Pope. In other words, he was a bomber pilot. As this man says, there were various bomber strikes. Well, they were, but they were by many pilots and many planes, so I have no way to know whether it was Pope in the bomber strike he refers to or not. Could have been. And as I understand it, and I think I have the official reports because I believe I got the first reports, that when he was shot, he was over water. He was shot down by guns on a boat, and so his plane landed in the water. The crew fished him out of the water, and he was taken prisoner that way. So his activities were pretty limited once he'd been shot down. Well, with all that sort of thing, the first time I ever heard the name Pope was when I heard that this man had been picked up out of the water off Indonesia. Before that, in our business, we never had the names of people. We never asked who they were. We just brought qualified men into the business and then let the operators command them. So I can't claim to know Pope or very much about him except from the operational side.
Let me refer to one of the questions. Another intriguing aspect, Indonesia did not mention the capture of Pope for 10 days. And
well, that'd be 10 days on their clock. On my clock, the first time I heard it was the first time I heard it, so I have no way to measure the date. See, the flight was clandestine as far as all of us were concerned.
In 1962, Robert Kennedy talked Pope out of jail. So
Well,
Robert Kennedy went there.
What he did is, because we knew the man was being held alive in Indonesia, we tried the same thing we're doing with the Vietnamese. There's an MIA, or POW, whatever category you want to call him, and we wanted to negotiate to bring him back. So President Kennedy sent Robert Kennedy there to meet with the government and to work out some agreement that they would release him. And they did that, and they released Pope, and he came back.
So there's not really much more to that story, you don't think?
Well, he's elaborated the story correctly, I assume, to the fact that there were bombings and all that sort of thing, but Pope was only one of many, and I can't tell who he's referring to when he mentions some raid on Manado or in South when he talks about General Masujian and things like that. I knew Masujian was leading the opposition. I mean, we had good records of everything that was going on, but
right.
In what he's saying here, he relates it all to Pope as though Pope was a story. Like he's confused with Gary Powers. Gary Powers was the only story on his flight in 1960. So there's no way to answer all the other questions under the name Pope. It doesn't work that way. They had that one man, and he happened to have ID with him, which is not, that's against the regulations of the agency, so it should not have been done. How he happened to have it with him, I don't know if anybody ever had any idea how he happened to keep it. Ordinarily, we strip the guy down, a doctor checks him, they put on a suit with no buttons, just zippers and no pockets, and he goes with nothing, you know, and that's the way clandestine work is done.
It sure reminds me of Gary Powers, though. You know,
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if this was another
Well,
operation set to fail.
It is a technology that was ignored, and therefore it does stir questions. Did somebody change the policy for his own ends for some reason that was not normal? Because normal is the pilot walks into a room where there's a doctor, and he goes through the doctor's inspection, and he has to take all his clothes off, empty his pockets, and then he puts on a flying suit. Actually, we went to the trouble of having a flying suit made of cloth that was from another country, and zippers made from another country, none attributable to the United States, as the plane was not. The plane, all the ID in the plane, little serial numbers on different things in the plane are all filed off or were never put on in the first place. And that's how you run a clandestine flight. Well, none of those things were followed in the case of either Powers or Pope. And in each case, when they went down, it completely embarrassed the operation and closed it down, that kind of thing. There is a similarity there, yes. It makes you think somebody, for some reason or other, wanted Pope to go down that day and prepared things for it.
And Eisenhower was president.
When Pope went down?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if that's the case, that would be a second embarrassment to Eisenhower.
Oh yes, definitely. Because he approved, you see, by definition, by law, the approval of clandestine operations in this country must be set up by the National Security Council only. No other part of the government has the power to run clandestine operations. And that's only 4 men: the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. And I'm speaking of that period when I was working in the business.
Yeah.
If they've changed the rules since then, that's somebody else's view. That's what it was in my time. So Eisenhower would have to have had the key vote on the National Security Council. But since the Security Council directed the operation, then we could say Eisenhower was as responsible as the other 3 men.
But as he mentioned, in the secret team going around people behind their back, going around them. In another interview, you had mentioned that you actually did have knowledge that Gary Power's flight was meant to fail.
Well,
it was no
shot down,
accident.
certainly, because even Mr. Dulles, Allen Dulles, in testimony before the Senate International Foreign Relations Committee under Senator Fulbright, Allen Dulles himself said that Powers wasn't shot down, that he came down due to a mechanical problem. Well, I had been told, for whatever it would be worth, that, and I got this in a note from a person in the level of the Office of Secretary of Defense, that certain people fixed the plane so it came down, and Gary Powers would know nothing about it.
But you made reference to those 4 men.
Yeah.
I think you said it was, yeah.
Pardon?
In one of your interviews, you mentioned that a fellow had come in to see you and say he had just had a little note, like a phone message note with 4 names on it. And see that? We figured out what really happened. And these guys set the flight up. So that's true. And secondly, you had mentioned as part of your job, somebody had asked you to deliver a special hydrogen tank for the hydrogen fuel.
Well, not a special one. My job was...
What I meant was, normally you just supply the hydrogen for those planes, and one came in that was only required to be half full.
Well, a lot of people misunderstand that because they don't understand the U-2.
Okay.
Including U-2 pilots. U-2 pilots wrote to me and thought that what I had written was wrong. Then later they wrote and said they found out it was right. You just put jet fuel like that guy going overhead right now. This U-2 going overhead. Aircraft fuel in a jet, it can fly to maybe 65, 70,000 feet and burn the fuel. But if the engine should backfire or some little momentary glitch, it can't relight. There's not enough oxygen up there to restart the engine, so it comes down. When it gets down to lower altitude, if the pilot chooses, he can restart it, and then if there's no other trouble, keep on flying.
That minimum be below 30,000 feet?
Oh, wherever he gets enough oxygen. Depends on what the danger, what caused the problem.
Yeah.
On the U-2, since they flew much higher than that, and flew with different engines than our ordinary jets, in order to burn that fuel and have the safety factor that it wouldn't flame out like that, we also included a bottle, like you use for a fire
extinguisher,
a pressure bottle of hydrogen. And the hydrogen is put in afterwards. It's extremely cold and so on, and explosive if it is affected by anything flammable. So we put the bottle of hydrogen in at the last minute, and then the pilot can fly, and most of the pilots don't even know it's in there, because when they inspect the plane earlier, as they usually do, they don't see the thing, but it's in there later. And then if by some chance the bottle had not been filled to the top, or some other malfunction in the bottle, and it ran out of hydrogen, his plane would come down, and he couldn't restart until he got down around, again, 30,000 or 20,000, and he could restart. And that's what Powers was trying to do. He was gliding down until he could get into the restart area. But he was then surrounded by MiGs because the Soviets had him on the radar. They just couldn't get him because they couldn't get up that high. And we knew that. We didn't mind them shooting the radar up at us. They couldn't get anything else up there. But when he got down to the lower altitude, the way he said himself, he said there was a merry-go-round of MiGs just flying around. So he's not about to restart. He just glided down and landed in a field. And that's what Eisenhower wrote in his own books, is Gary Powers landed in a field. Well, people ought to know that. Now, in Pope's case, there's no hydrogen bottle involved. That's he just was shot down, he claimed, by guns on the deck of the ship that he flew over. And the ship was not his target. He went not after the ship. But he had only land targets. But he flew over the ship and they shot him down.
And then this fellow's last question was, Pope is probably still alive.
I wouldn't have the slightest doubt.
Would he be taken care of? Just pension, military pension? Just asked to relocate?
Sure. He was always an Air Force officer. He wasn't a CIA man. He was always an Air Force officer. We don't cut him out of the Air Force when they work.
It seemed to be this guy might be looking for him to get his side of the story.
Yeah.
But
there's no way to know because, first of all, it was none of my business. We didn't ever use names. He wouldn't know who I was, and I wouldn't know who he was, and we didn't do it for business that way. We kept it that way. There were thousands of men in the CIA that my system had put there, and we weren't about to be, myself or the people that worked for me, to meet them face to face, except in very unusual situations.
Well, one last question about the U-2. In other interviews, I heard that was your department supplying hydrogen for the program.
My department supplied everything. You know, our job was to provide the military support, and this is the quoted words of my job, to provide the military support of the clandestine operations of the CIA. So, and that covered the whole Defense Department. If they needed pencils for some reason, we brought them pencils. If they needed gasoline, we provided gasoline. If they needed 100 men, we provided 100 men. We might provide 300 so they could take their choice, that kind of thing. But whatever the request was, whenever we found out that the U-2 was going on a flight, we had the pilot, we had the plane, we had the fuel, we had everything it took, and among other things was for this kind of flight, was an ordinary bottle of hydrogen. And without the hydrogen, if it wasn't put on, there's where the problem of the plane coming down, and that's what Alan Dulles explained, that he had a flame out and came down. Alan Dulles put that on the congressional record in May of 1960. Why people can't read a congressional record and see that, I'm amazed, because it's right there, been there ever since 1960.
Well, I think it has to do with people have to make an effort to actually unlearn a story they've been told. And that effort is going to take some effort. What do you mean it wasn't shot down?
See, what they are not looking at is it was in Khrushchev's interest to say he shot it down for his own people. He couldn't admit that for 4 years we've been flying over Russia and that they didn't have the ability to shoot the plane down. So the minute one came down, he had no choice but to say that it was shot. I bet he didn't even ask his commanders how the heck it came down or where it was or whatever in the first instance. And the fact that it landed safely and he had the pilot alive and well, he didn't release that information until 5 days later. And then he said, look, I hear all these stories coming from the United States about what Powers was doing. He said, they don't seem to know that I've got the pilot here alive and well. Well, that changed the whole scenario. But it's Khrushchev who said the plane was shot down. And then later, our people, including Alan Dulles and President Eisenhower, said, no, it wasn't shot down, he landed. Well, by that time, the newspapers and everybody else had got set on the idea it was shot down, and so they just kept printing it stupidly when it appeared in the congressional record. They apparently don't read the congressional record. When I wrote it in my book, even U-2 pilots began to tell me that it couldn't have happened because U-2s don't fly with hydrogen. They weren't aware of all that either, so that was quite unusual. They weren't aware of the fact that U-2 that Powers flew had a different camera in it entirely than the usual camera for U-2s, because the camera was a bigger secret than the U-2. We didn't want, whoever knew that the plane was going to come down didn't want to expose the camera, so we had an ordinary old 2-bit camera in there for the reconnaissance and not
The bomber camera,
not-
World War II bomber.
well, whatever camera, and just a reconnaissance camera. And the Lundall, the beautiful camera that was doing the work for the U-2, the thing that made the U-2 special, was not in that plane.
In another interview, you mentioned you've got the serial number of the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's...
So.
And that would probably be when the Soviets were displaying all the wreckage, they would have had that on a big...
They had it on a table in their court trial. See, they had this big show, invited reporters from all over the world for this wonderful trial they were going to hold. And as they did, they showed all the equipment. Well, among other things, the Lockheed people looked at every picture carefully, and they sent a note to the Air Force saying the parts they have that they had said was the crashed parts of the plane aren't the Lockheed, but the parts on the table where they got the plane later when it didn't crash and they were whole, that is the Lockheed, the U-2. So the Russians were playing a game with the thing the same as we were, for their benefit.
The U-2 could reach 90,000 feet, much higher than Soviet MiGs or SA-2 missiles could reach. Allen Dulles briefed Colonel Andrew Goodpaster, who was Eisenhower's intermediary to the CIA. Allen Dulles stated that we were unlikely to lose a U-2, and if we did, the pilot would not survive. We were told, and it was part of an understanding of the situation, that it was almost certain that the plane would disintegrate, and that we could take it as a certainty that no pilot could survive. It's possible Gary Powers did not use the ejection seat because he may have wondered if it would have blown him up as well. The NSA reported Powers had been tracked down to 30,000 feet, and then when turning back to Sverdlovsk, was intercepted. Soviet fighter chatter revealed a pilot reporting, "He's turning! He's turning!" Soviet pilot Igor Menchikov reported in 1996 that he flew in front of the U-2 at around 30,000 feet as wash from his Su-9 broke one of Powers' wings, causing him to slowly circle to the ground. This had previously happened to a U-2 plane in September of 1958 in a mishap with a Canadian F-86 in West Germany. It has also been suggested that a Soviet mole was responsible for the malfunction. KGB officer Viktor Shmenov claimed that someone leaked the flight plan ahead of time. Colonel Prouty's view was that the sabotage was American by design, and one of the reasons for Eisenhower's distrust of the military complex. Fletcher Prouty never did reveal the names of those four men.